Out of context, facts and figures can easily mislead. Is Africa's growing population a weakness? What about tomorrow? Don't get boxed in by today's opinions. With the Africa Report, understand Africa's tomorrow today. Politics, business, opinion, the Africa Report decodes the news for you. Available online on theafricareport.com.
Большинство российских миллиардеров читали Forbes еще до того, как стали главными героями его страниц. Роман Троценко, Леонид Богуславский, Михаил Фридман, Алексей Мордашов. Что общего у этих людей? Их объединяет Forbes Club. Forbes Club – это закрытые уникальные встречи российских бизнесменов и топ-менеджеров с членами списков Forbes, учеными, экономистами, писателями, политиками, общественными деятелями и другими лидерами общественного мнения. Став членом закрытого сообщества с картой привилегий Forbes Club, вы сможете высказать свою позицию в журнале Forbes, вести персональную страницу на сайте Forbes, посещать закрытые мероприятия, пользоваться цифровой платформой, посещать персональные встречи с менторами клуба. Клуб успешных людей, объединенных общими ценностями и взглядом на жизнь.
Бизнес – это риски. Выявлять риски и эффективно управлять ими помогают решения Интерфакса. Создавая эти сервисы, мы опираемся на наш опыт работы с информацией, знание потребностей клиентов и качественный контент. IT-решения Интерфакса преобразуют информацию в знания. Они помогают нашим клиентам вовремя принимать решения, снижать риски и расширять деловые связи. Интерфакс – IT-системы для бизнеса.
Hello, everyone. It's great that you join us today. Welcome again to Renaissance Capital 25th Anniversary Conference on Emerging and Frontier Markets. I hope you are enjoying the full week of sessions and meetings. And today we're here to speak about our Russia and CIS plus macro outlook for you. So just before we start, some technical issues. If you want to ask a question, you can post it to the dialog box next to our presentation in Zoom or in our YouTube channel. So I will be happy to answer any of your questions in the last part of the session. So yes, so again, let's start with a very short summary. I believe that CIS plus region still looks good for us as a medium-term macro story, providing appealing opportunities for both equity and fixed income investors going forward. This year, CIS region withstood the corona crisis in relatively good shape, I believe, with an economic contraction below global average and fiscal positions remaining stronger for most currencies than for EM peers. So we see only moderate depreciation of national currency relative to previous two crises, and no spikes of inflation or dollarization, and only one sovereign rating downgrade, which is already quite good, I believe, given that we are living in a universe that more than 1/4 of all sovereign ratings were downgraded this year. So at the same, so we expect to see a growth rebound in 2021, supported by global recovery and expected opening of borders, and as well as stronger sentiments on the emerging and frontier market as a whole, which we expect to be a result of recent US elections, together with some domestic stimuli posted by governments and a solid demand or a solid recovery of domestic consumption. However, political developments are still to be monitored, given that this year it was quite a tough year, I suppose, in terms of political developments in CIS plus region, probably as well as globally. So here we have sanction pressures and rising concerns about US sanctions on Russia, as well as some tensions after elections in Belarus, in Georgia and Moldova, as well as a military conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan that came as a negative surprise for us this year. Switching to Russia in more details, I believe that though all of us are a bit sick and tired of all this corona news flow in recent months, but still I think it's one of the most vivid topics that we could discuss in Russia, given the progress that was already made in vaccine. I'm not mentioning like global vaccine progress, but if we're looking at Russia, we have 2 vaccines already registered back in August and recently in October, and both are reportedly ready for a large-scale production. 40,000 volunteers were already vaccinated during testing period, and personally, I know quite few people who already got a testing vaccine, and they now are enjoying a strong immunity over the coronavirus with only moderate side effects reported, no tangible side effects reported. So by the end of this year, according to producers, they are ready to supply close to 5-6 million doses per month by already somewhere close to the end of this year. And by spring, officials reports that we will get close to 15 million doses per month. This is enough to vaccinate all Russians aged above 60 in 2 months, as well as, for example, enough to vaccinate in 2 months the whole Uzbekistan, which already has a contract on 30 million doses of Russian vaccine. So we expect that Russia will both start a domestic vaccination and could launch an export already starting in the first half of 2021. More than 20 countries are in discussion on the import of Russian vaccines, including India, who potentially has a contract on 100 million doses, which is the largest potential importer, and also some LATAM countries as well as regional neighbors of Russia. So yeah, adding about some numbers about the second wave. Now we are coming through the second wave, but in Moscow, which is quite a good benchmark for the country as a whole, and where the testing is the most intensive initially. We already saw a kind of stabilization of the number of new cases in the recent 2 weeks, which I expect to be quite a positive signal. And we are not expecting to see a full-scale lockdown in Russia anytime soon. In 2021, we will already be supported by a large-scale production of the vaccine. So only moderate quarantine restrictions are seen now, mostly focused on social activity and entertainment. So they should not have tangible effect on economic activity, and we still expect the fourth quarter to be better than the third quarter in terms of economic activity. So we remain bullish on Russian growth. So we keep our above consensus forecast starting from mid this year. We expect a contraction at only 3.3, and now we see how consensus is moving toward our forecast, given that in the second quarter the consensus stood at somewhere from 5 to 6% contraction, and now it is already at 4%. So Russia looks good relative to oil exporters peers. So with a contraction close to emerging market average and below the global average. We think that this positive outlook is supported by a combination of three factors, including strong starting point, given large accumulated buffers and the gains of the period of a great stabilization policy, which we saw for recent 5 years before the crisis. Second, it's moderate structural sensitivities of the economy to all kinds of lockdowns, given that the share of consumer services within GDP is not that large. And three is a decent policy response, including both the fact that economists get as support from a fiscal side, and that quarantine restrictions in the end of the day were not that prolonged and not that strict. So we estimate the growth we expect the growth to rebound to 3.8 in 2021, and even after the catch-up growth will fade, we expect the potential growth for Russia to stabilize at 2.5 to 3%, which is probably not that much relative to EM market average, but still it's 1.5% higher than the average for previous 5 years. Our unconsensus call that I should mention is the call on interest rates of the central bank and the trajectory for 2021. Even though our chief economist, global chief economist, Charlie Robertson, thinks that we are entering a period, an era when we could see the prolonged period of low inflation and low rate for many EM markets, we still think that for Russia it's a little bit too early to say that inflation is that. So we are rather expect that we will see a scenario of a sticky inflation. We're not talking about inflation spikes, but we expect inflation to stay sticky at close 4% plus level in 2021. So not too much disinflation momentum to be realized. This sticky inflation dynamics should be supported by a combination of a solid recovery of consumer demand that should be supported by steady income growth, partially amid government support and protracted fiscal stimulus. And the second, soft ruble dynamics. I will talk in more details about this a bit later. And in terms of the central bank reaction, I would say that so I spent 10 years in the Central Bank of Russia. So my feeling is that it's a bit too early to expect that the central bank is now a proper, like, dovish central bank. Just because what we saw in recent 5 to 7 years is that central bank always stayed on the cautious side with a kind of a hawkish bias. And even though for now we have quite a dovish rhetorics of the central bank recently, but at the same time, I would remind that there's just same people in the board of the central of the board of directors of the central bank to take decisions in coming years. Those who have quite asymmetric reaction to inflation risk in previous 5 years. So we expect what is our base case is that despite the signal and the market consensus of about that the key rate will stay at 4.25, so at current level for another 1 year, we expect rather to see an earlier normalization of monetary policy with rate hikes already starting in the first half of 2021, and the rate back to what we estimate as a neutral rate at 5.5 by the end of the next year. The one figure to add is that Russia is not a country with a long track record on inflation targeting, but still we have 3 years of a stable inflation from 2017 to 2019. And for this period, the average inflation was at 3.6, while the average key rate stood at 7.5. And I would remind that there was not a period of any kind of an overheating in the Russian economy to be compensated by the monetary policy, but instead it was a period of quite tight fiscal policy and challenging external developments. So even though I would not argue that the neutral rate for Russia now stands any close to 7%, but still I think this is a good illustration to hint that the probability of interest rate hikes for the next year would be much higher than the probability of interest rates cuts in Russia. So turning to ruble, we see that ruble is undervalued, close to 5% undervalued now, driven by intensified concerns around U.S. sanctions on the eve of U.S. elections, as well as the concerns around the second wave. However, in our base case, we do not put any kind of the heavy sanctions to be imposed from the side of US. So we expect the dust to settle somewhere close to the end of this year or the beginning of the next year, with the ruble going closer to a fair value, which we estimate to be at from 73 to 74 rubles per dollar for an oil price at from 40 to 43 dollars per barrel. So assuming again no heavy sanctions, we expect the ruble to appreciate to these levels somewhere closer to the beginning of 2021. But if we're talking about the next year, the 2021, though we put as an assumption an increase of oil prices to $50 per barrel in average for 2021-2022, we still do not see too much room for a strong appreciation of ruble. And two important factors to limit the scope for appreciation for next year is the expected import recovery, including a potential recovery of tourism outflows that accounts for close to $30 billion or 2% of GDP, which is, I believe, quite something. And the second factor is that we expect the support to ruble from the side of the central bank FX interventions to recede starting from the next year, given that FX interventions will be back in line to the fiscal rule and no additional interventions to be seen next year, unlike this year where we saw probably the most complicated mechanism of FX interventions during recent 10 years. So for the next year, our base case is that we will see ruble in average at 75.5 versus dollar. The sanction risk is a hot topic. Clearly, it was a hot topic during recent 2 months. But again, we have. Speaking with our clients, I think we have two different types of investors here. One part of probably more than a half assume that there is no tangible sanction risk for Russia, and the markets have already adopted to any kinds of the moderate sanction pressure during recent years. And the second part of investor base is probably more worried about this risk. Two important checking points for us to monitor is first the report of the Director of Intelligence Unit, which should be done about the potential interference of Russia and other countries into election process. That should be done in 45 days after elections. And second, we should monitor the discussion around the annual US defense bill with potential additional sanctions on Nord Stream to include it into the document. So the base case for us is that given the Biden win, we will have some intensification of sanction pressure of US toward Russia, probably most probably in form of the sectoral sanctions, including those potentially to oil and gas sector and probably financial markets, given the rhetorics of the pre-election rhetorics of the Biden team. And at the same time, we do not expect in our base case to see broad counter sanctions like sanctions on government debt market. We will assume a low and 10% probability of moderate sanctions, including potential sanctions of secondary Eurobond market or primary OFZ markets, and below 5% probability for potential sanctions on the secondary OFZ market. The latter could be the largest potential risk among all options, which could be on the table. And this is the scenario where we could saw a potential depreciation of ruble from 15 to 30%, with the potential hike of domestic rates driven by both the spike of the risk premium for Russia using potentially sanctions of 2015 as a benchmark, as well as the decrease of the share of outflow of international investors from this sector. We will monitor the development of this risk and will consider them. But still, if we will see the decrease of concerns around US sanctions that we expect to see in the first quarter of 2021, then this could add to the decrease of the risk premium, which is now potentially seen in the longer end of the OFZ curve. And again, I think that one thing that we should note that given how strong the fiscal position of Russia is now, we should really assume a really heavy sanctions on Russia to compromise the fiscal sustainability of the country. Given that the public debt of Russia stays below 20%, which is 4 times below the BRICS average without Russia, and given that the fiscal fiscal deficit for this year stays at only close to 4%, even given all these kinds of anti-crisis stimuli, and this is 3 times below the BRICS average without Russia, and the public debt is still the lowest in the CIS plus region. And we should add to that Russia have close to 12% of GDP accumulated, of fiscal savings accumulated in the National Wealth Fund, which is, according to our estimates, is enough to balance fiscal position, fiscal expenditures, to finance fiscal expenditures for more than 10 years, even if oil stays at as low as $30 per barrel, which is clearly not our base case. Adding to this FX reserves, above $500 billion, covering 30 months of import and exceeding the total amount of the external debt. We see that both fiscal and external position remains extremely safe for Russia. Looking from the other perspective, we expect the fiscal consolidation this time to be relatively smooth. Even though the headline fiscal balance, we expect the headline fiscal balance to decline from close to 4% of GDP this year to only 0.5% of GDP next year and close to 0 in 2022. But at the same time, non-oil fiscal balance will decrease a bit softer, and this is really that is important to estimate the effect of the fiscal position in terms of supporting economic activity. And I should note that fiscal expenditures in coming years, even despite a soft consolidation, will remain close to 2% of GDP, above what we saw in 2017-2019. So there is quite a stimulus to be offered to the economy by the government. However, again, given the expected cyclical improvement of fiscal revenues, we would expect that the fiscal deficit will decrease, driven the decrease of OFZ placements to 2.5 to 3 trillion rubles per year in 2021-2022, after record high 2.5 trillion rubles this year, which was again comfortably was absorbed by both domestic and external investors, even despite some concerns that were seen in the middle of this year. Sorry. And given the fact that fiscal oil and gas fiscal expenditures has declined to historical lows, below 30% of the total revenues, we expect to, in our base case, we expect to see further increase of non-oil taxes in Russia, primarily including the income tax, and probably the most probable option is the switch to a proportional income tax, which is this option is discussed already for years. And given that the starting point is relatively low, with income tax at only 13%, now that could be a decent compromise in terms of the fiscal financing. But at the same time, as I've mentioned, the government is still ready to provide quite a stimulus, given that unlike the period of previous fiscal consolidation and the period of previous disinflation in 2016-2017, this time no decrease of indexations of social payments and wages in budget sectors are planned. So I recall that the public sector still accounts for close to 30% of employment in terms of the total labor force. So there is still quite an important benchmark, and the government plans above 5% indexation for the budget sector and social payments, and as well as set a target to see a growth of overall real wages into the economy at 3% in year-on-year terms in both 2021 and 2022. This should support the relatively strong domestic recovery that I've already mentioned to be a part of our GDP and inflation outlook. Just a few words about e-commerce, which is booming in Russia and have a strong potential and scope for further growth. But you can hear about this in more details during the next panel session, which will follow this session about and will be focused on consumer markets in Russia. So please join. Turning to other countries of the region, I believe that our top story, macro story, remains Kazakhstan remains our top macro story, given that the country benefits from a mix of strong fundamentals and strong accumulated buffers, decent policy response, and the lack of political risk, given that the country already passed the smooth political transition domestically in 2019. I have really balanced external relations. The global oil market outlook remains quite important for Kazakhstan, primarily in terms of the dynamics of the national currency. But given our base case forecast with oil at 50, we see a scope for an appreciation of Kazakhstan tenge that for now looks to be closer to fair value. And we praise again accumulated fiscal buffers accumulated by Kazakhstan with close to 35% of GDP accumulated in the National Oil Fund, which is above the total public debt of the country. And this year, again, we saw quite a strong recovery, even despite the fact that country passed already passed two waves of COVID and 2 waves of lockdowns. The other country worth looking at is Georgia, though it is affected by post-elections political noises now, but still there is a country where we see the largest appreciation potential among all CIS plus countries and the largest monetary easing potential among all CIS countries in coming 12 months. So we could see above 10% appreciation in next 6 to 8 months, given that a potential tourism rebound could strengthen the external position of the country, as well as to support the growth rebound of about 6% after close to 5% contraction for this year. And again, the one positive factor is a structural visitor is skewed toward the region, so there's no need for a large-scale opening of flights. It's only enough to open land borders in many senses. So again, just reiterating our calls on the region, we saw that the fiscal and financial position of most CIS plus countries this year was really strong. I would also should note the one other impressive story is Uzbekistan, which is the sole country to avoid a recession in 2020. We see quite a strong potential for this country, which benefits from opening up and following a decent reform agenda. And we see a strong pipeline of fixed income placement building up, so worth looking at. So I think probably given our timing, I should stop here. And I'm ready to answer any questions if there are any. So give me 1 second to monitor your questions. It seems that we have no questions for now. So thanks again for joining, and please enjoy the next session that will be focused on the consumer market development in Russia.
Out of context, facts and figures can easily mislead. Is Africa's growing population a weakness? What about tomorrow? Don't get boxed in by today's opinions. With the Africa Report, understand Africa's tomorrow today. Politics, business, opinion, the Africa Report decodes the news for you. Available online on theafricareport.com.
Большинство российских миллиардеров читали Forbes еще до того, как стали главными героями его страниц. Роман Троценко, Леонид Богуславский, Михаил Фридман, Алексей Мордашов. Что общего у этих людей? Их объединяет Forbes Club. Forbes Club – это закрытые уникальные встречи российских бизнесменов и топ-менеджеров с членами списков Forbes, учеными, экономистами, писателями, политиками, общественными деятелями и другими лидерами общественного мнения. Став членом закрытого сообщества с картой привилегий Forbes Club, вы сможете высказать свою позицию в журнале Forbes, вести персональную страницу на сайте Forbes, посещать закрытые мероприятия, пользоваться цифровой платформой, посещать персональные встречи с менторами клуба. Клуб успешных людей, объединенных общими ценностями и взглядом на жизнь.
Бизнес – это риски. Выявлять риски и эффективно управлять ими помогают решения Интерфакса. Создавая эти сервисы, мы опираемся на наш опыт работы с информацией, знание потребностей клиентов и качественный контент. IT-решения Интерфакса преобразуют информацию в знания. Они помогают нашим клиентам вовремя принимать решения, снижать риски и расширять деловые связи. Интерфакс – IT-системы для бизнеса.